Hello, I'm Senator Rod Grams, and this is the May edition of Washington Report. Thank you for joining us. With April and the deadline for filing federal income taxes finally behind us, you may be tempted to breathe a sigh of relief and think that you're off the hook as far as the federal government is concerned. Unfortunately, that's not the case. Tax Freedom Day has yet to arrive. Tax Freedom Day is the day average Americans are no longer working just to pay taxes to Uncle Sam and his counterparts at the state and local level, and can begin keeping their money for themselves. National Tax Freedom Day doesn't arrive until May 7th this year, the latest ever, thanks to the massive tax increase imposed on you by President Clinton and Congress in 1993. That means that every single dollar you've earned for the 128 days between January 1st and May 7th is gone to feed the government. The news for Minnesotans is even worse. Because of our higher than average state taxes, we have to wait 7 days longer than most Americans before our Tax Freedom Day arrives. It is proof that Minnesotans are being victimized by a tax system that consumes large chunks of your income and offers middle-class taxpayers little in return. Now, during a series of tax freedom town hall meetings, I recently had the opportunity to hear how Minnesotans feel about the tax burden that they're asked to bear. In our program today, you'll get to sit in on our Duluth meeting where Minnesotans shared firsthand their stories about a tax system that has ravaged their wallets and left them wondering where all their money goes. We also talked about government spending, the deficit, and the national debt that is mortgaging away our children's and our grandchildren's future. Now, I appreciated the opportunity to meet with these concerned Minnesotans, and I hope you'll enjoy hearing from them as well. So, three questions I think you should ask yourself when you're busy around your kitchen tables at the end of every month balancing your checkbook, trying to set the priorities in how you spend your money. Do you have a feeling that you're getting squeezed with the cash that you have left? In other words, we call it the middle class squeeze. And when you're trying to balance your checkbook, you should also ask yourself the question, shouldn't the federal government have to balance its budget as you do? When it comes to taxes, do you feel like you're paying more and getting less? And also, do you ever wonder where the money goes and what it is used for? So where does it all start? And I think I've got some charts here, and I'm going to try to go through these quickly again so I can leave some time for questions and answers. But you got to ask yourself, where does this all start? Where does the government get its revenue and the money? And of course, it all comes from us, the taxpayers. One way or the other, as taxpayers and consumers, we pay the money into the federal government. The government in 1995, this is the breakdown on the revenues that it accumulated. $835 billion came from taxes, from your 10W or your 1040, your income taxes that you file on the 15th of April. That's where the government got $835 billion that it spent. Trust funds. This is money collected through your FICA withholding taxes, other trust funds, gas taxes, airport fees, but trust fund accounts, separate from the general fund, about $511 billion. And then, of course, to make up the difference of the money that the government spent but didn't have revenues for, it went out and borrowed about $192 billion. So that's how the sources of revenue that the government took in the last year. Give you an idea, too, on how it means or relates to you as a family. Back in 1955, the average family in the United States made about $5,200 a year and paid less than 20% of that in taxes. Today, the average income of Americans across the country per household is about $45,000 a year, and you pay well over $11,000 of that into income taxes, or nearly 28% on average. And this is total taxes per household that has overwhelmed U.S. families when you look at the amount of money. That per household in 1900, we spent about $1,370 per household in taxes. By 1950, that went to $6,970, and in 1994, per household, over $18,600 a year in taxes to American families, and this is both in state and federal government. So when we look at Tax Freedom Day in this country, and we talk about Tax Freedom Day as the day that you stop working for government and start working for yourselves. In other words, the money you can take home in order to provide for your family, food, clothing, shelter, education, recreation, or whatever. Tax Freedom Day in Minnesota is May 14th. It's one of the latest in the country because Minnesota has some of the higher taxes in the state. But that means you work more than the first 5.5 months of the year to pay taxes. Now, if we add in what's another thing they like to add in, and that's called regulations and mandates, or costs that you pay in the
what would be higher prices for products because of what businesses have to pay to meet regulations and mandates. Now, some of those are good. We don't argue with them, but what we argue with is excessive regulations and mandates. But they have to pass that cost on to you. Their higher taxes, their cost of doing business, all gets wrapped up into the cost of the product. That is passed on to you, and the estimates are, and I don't have the chart here, but Tax Freedom Day is actually July the 7th. So that means you work better than half of the year to meet those required payments to the government. So for 50 cents or more of every dollar that you make on average in this country, it goes to the government to support its programs and what Washington wants to do and what St. Paul wants to do, rather than what you think you should do or could do better with your own money. Now, Peter, do we have chart number 3? As I mentioned, what we can't bring in revenues, we have been borrowing, and you've all heard about the national debt, that we're over $5 trillion now in the national debt. Our deficit this year was well over nearly $190 billion. The interest that we're now paying on it, and that means out of the revenues collected, how much went to pay the interest payment. In 1970, about 5% of all the money we collected went to pay the interest on the debt. And this is another thing, we don't even touch the principal. You know, when you buy a home and you make your interest payment every month, you're paying interest and principal. It might be a small part of the principal at first, but you are making principal payments. We're not even doing that. We're just trying to service the debt to pay the interest. It used to be 5% of our budget. Today it's grown to 15% of our budget. And I'd just like to then show you where it all goes and how does the federal government spend this money every year. The vast majority of the budget, about 70%, is now being consumed what we call by mandatory spending. These are the entitlement programs that are written into law that says we have to spend or match these needs. By the way, a lot of the entitlements, you don't know what the need is going to be, so you don't know how much it's going to be. It's like we don't know if Medicare this year or welfare payments or whatever the entitlement might be is going to cost $200 billion or $201 billion or $202 billion. But whatever the bills are, we say under law we have to pay those. And then the other, what we call discretionary spending, which national defense takes about half, then other non-defense discretionary spending. And these are things like infrastructure, roads, airports, education, other programs. So you can see the vast majority of it goes to what is mandatory, and again, 15% of that goes just to pay the interest. Now, one thing, too, with what we're doing here, if we don't change the entitlement programs or get a handle on our spending, by the year 2012, every dollar that you send in and the government collects in revenue will go to meet the entitlement programs and pay the interest on the debt. In other words, there'll be no money left if we don't change the way we're spending in Washington or change how these programs are handled. There'll be no money left for defense, for education, for roads, for any other things that the government wants to or that the society feels it should have in spending programs. Everything will be consumed by the entitlement programs and interest on the debt. Talk a little bit about the trust funds. Peter, do we have a chart on the trust funds again? Now, you've heard a lot of the talk in the news about Medicare and the trust fund, and that it's going to go bankrupt by the year 2002 if we don't do something to change it. Well, that might even be faster than that, because the latest numbers last year that came out in October said that instead of having a surplus in Medicare payments last year, which is up to this time we've been trying to put money into a savings account, say on Medicare, and we expected another $4.7 billion surplus that we could take and put in this trust fund to help supplement when the spending hit a shortfall. The only thing is we hit a shortfall last year. We lost $38 million in Medicare spending. So we're beginning to have to draw out of this trust fund already. Now, this trust fund, it was expected to last till the year 2002. So in other words, we've already passed that. So the trust fund could go broke by the year 1999 or the year 2000 if the spending continues. So when we talk about we've got to make changes in the trust fund for Medicare to make sure that the program remains solvent and that it's there for those who need the system and need those benefits, and also for the next generation. If we don't change this by the year 2002 at least, this program will be broke. A couple of ways that we could fix it. The studies say right now, if we would right now raise taxes $388 billion put into that trust fund just for Medicare, and that would come out of your withholding taxes. For the average worker in this country, it'd be nearly $600 a year in added withholding taxes just to fund that in order to keep this program going again till the year like 2010. If we don't change the system, if we don't overhaul it and make it more efficient and to keep it active, the only other thing we're going to do is raise taxes. So we've got a choice that we're facing. Do we either go back and try fix it, limit the payments on Medicare? And when we talk about limit, we're going to grow in Medicare payments. The average recipient, the cost to the government this year is $4,700. Under the Republican proposal that we had on the desk for the President to sign, that would go to $7,300 by the year 2002. And that would keep Medicare solvent through the year 2012. But that got vetoed. That's called a cut. I mean, when you go from $4,700 to $7,300, that's not a cut. I'll get to you in a minute, ma'am. I'll just try to go through these quick. But we need to begin to control the costs of Medicare, or we're going to run out of money faster, or we're going to have to go back and raise taxes. And by the way, that's what's been done over the last 15 years. 3 times we've hit a similar situation where Medicare is running into trouble, and we had to do something to fix it. The only thing we did, or Congress did, was to raise your taxes. And if you look at what your withholding taxes were 15 years ago compared to today, so we've done nothing to fix the system. We've just gone to the taxpayer and says that we need to take more money from you. So basically, the program would reduce the growth of Medicare from about 10% a year down to about a 7% growth a year. And even at 7%, that's nearly 3 times the rate of inflation. So to say that we can't somehow deliver the adequate service we need in a program, by the way, that in the year 2002 will cost us, we'll have spent $1.62 trillion on Medicare alone over the next 7 years. And I think that we've got to be able to have that system work without going to the taxpayers and raise more money. Also, Social Security is another big issue. Everybody, thinks that when they have paid money into the Social Security, that somehow those dollars have gone into a cabinet or a file that says your name on it, and that you have prepaid some interest or prepaid your retirement benefits. Social Security is a pay-as-you-go system. The dollar you pay in today goes out today in benefits for those who are retired. And what you're hoping is that there is going to be people behind you that are going to be there to pay into the system so you can collect those dollars when you retire. And it was in if I'm not mistaken, about 1950, there was 20 people working for every person on retired benefits. Today, it's 3 people are working for every person that's retired, and in the next 7 or 8 years, it's going to be 2 people working for every person that's on retirement, because as the baby boomers hit this age, it's going to put a real strain on it. So there is no account there. And what we have done is we have borrowed the money out of this trust fund. This money that we've collected this year alone, 1995, if we collected $168 in Social Security benefits, we paid out $168 went into the trust fund. We had a $68 billion surplus in Social Security this year, so it went into what we call the trust fund, the savings account, to try, as we need this money more in the year 2012 and 2013, we'd be able to go into that savings account and take it out and supplement the payment, because in the year 2013 we're going to bring in $100, but we're going to have to pay out $110. So we don't bring in a surplus anymore. We need the trust account, the savings account. The problem with that is that the only place, if you have pension plans or involved in a pension, you know that a good pension plan takes your money and invests it in good sound investments, so to try to bring in interest to increase your retirement account so you have more money to retire on, and also safe sound investments. Well, Social Security, under law, the only place we can invest Social Security dollars, the surplus, is into government. Well, what's sounder than the U.S. government? Nothing. So we invest it. So we buy Treasury bills. And so we take, say, $10 out of the trust fund, buy a $10 Treasury bill. The Treasury bill goes into the trust fund, the $10 goes into the general fund, and we spend it. And as you saw, this has all been spent in 1995. So there is no money in the trust fund. So when we need that money, it's just a reverse process. Once the trust fund can't support itself, or the system, it has to go to the savings account So we'll go there and we'll take out one of those $10 treasury notes, and we'll take it and we say we got to cash this in. Well, where do we take it? We got to take it to the taxpayer, because the taxpayer is responsible for those notes. So that isn't even figured into the budget. There's no way right now that we have revenues to begin to pay that back. So I'm just saying that's another problem that we're going to have. So what can we do about all this? This is what I think is so important, and what you've heard us talk about for a long time. Everybody agrees with it. We've got to balance the budget. We've got to come up with an agreement on a balanced budget to make sure that we stop borrowing from our children. It's not only fiscally irresponsible and wrong, but it's morally wrong. The generation ahead of us did not borrow money and leave us in debt. They financed World War II. They paid for that in the 40s and the 50s. But over the last 25 years, we have borrowed $5 trillion that none of us in this room are going to live long enough to pay back. So if we can't pay back this huge sum of money, who's going to pay it? Our kids. Somebody has to pay it. And if they live out their lives and they can't pay it, their kids, our grandchildren are going to be stuck with this bill. So basically, we're asking our children and our grandchildren to pay for the goods and services that we consume today, because we can't make the tough decision not to buy more than we can afford. So that's the decision. I'll say this real quickly, and then I'm going to go to this chart. But you hear about the $270 billion tax cut that Republicans were proposing. And the argument was we were going to take from some, the poorest of the society, to give to the rich of the society. So in other words, we were going to take from one program to give a tax break to the rich. All right, that's not true. And I'll tell you why. Because we had to balance the budget first. That means we have to get a hold on our spending for Medicare, Medicaid. Trim the growth is all we're talking about. There isn't any program, only one program in the entire federal budget had an actual cut in our budget, and that was defense. That was the only program that will see an actual decline in spending over the next 7 years. Every other program grows. And as I showed you, Medicare will grow at 7%. Some programs might not grow as much, maybe 2 or 3%, but the average growth of all the programs is 3%. And we have to hold the limit on that growth to about 3%. It's the benefits. If we balance the budget, economists will tell you, Wall Street will tell you, that interest rates will drop at least 2%. Now, if interest rates drop 2%, this is what an average family in the country would feel as a benefit from a balanced budget. Just if you could get Congress to balance their budget and stop borrowing all this money, these are the benefits you would have. On an average home mortgage, you could save nearly $2,400 a year in payments. So your payment on your house could drop about $200 a month under one interest rate compared to the one today. On an average car loan, about $1,000. If you've helped with your children in an average student loan, you could save about $1,800 over the life of that student loan. So an average family over their lifetime could expect to save about $71,000 just in interest costs, plus other benefits that would go along with that. Now, the government is a huge borrower and spender. The federal government, according to the Congressional Budget Office, would save $277 billion in its costs. Just like a family would save in its costs, the federal government in the next 7 years would save $277 billion.
Your approach is looking good, Cobra.
The men and women in the National Guard and Reserve face some tough challenges when they serve. Challenges that teach them discipline, leadership, and technical skills that make them better employees. So when they need time off to serve, don't make their toughest challenge approaching you.
My hero? Isaiah Thomas. Kevin Costner. Mr. Wong.
These are teachers, but to the kids they've reached, they're heroes.
My hero? Mrs. Wooten. If I don't get through to that child, who knows, maybe no one else will.
Teachers have the power to wake up young minds, to be heroes, to make a difference. Reach for that power. Teach. Find out how by calling 1-800-45-TEACH. Be a teacher. Be a hero.
I don't want to make a long answer, but I'll tell you, if we compared ourselves to Sweden, and you know, Sweden has been held up as a shining example of socialism. Sweden is going broke so fast that it can't privatize fast enough. If we put our deficit in their economy, we would be facing about $1 trillion a year deficit, not the 100, and you said 64. That's pretty close to what the president is reporting, debt per year, deficit per year. Our plan, and they're going to get to a balanced budget in Sweden in 3 years. That's their proposal, to go from $1 trillion deficit to zero, a balanced budget in 3 years. We're proposing to go from $164 billion deficit to zero in 7 years, and we can't get Congress to pat themselves on the back, stop patting themselves on the back for spending your money to do it. So it could be done. We're trying to do it in a most gradual fashion by still allowing government to grow so people don't feel this, you know, in this reduction in growth. So, you know, we could argue all that, but a decision that had been made and to do it over 7 years, I thought it was a very prudent plan, and I supported it. And there were some people that have had budget plans in 3 years, 4 years, and 5 years that would have been a little bit more, you know, drastic in the reduction in the growth, holding it to 2% rather than 3%. So that's asking the government under our plan to say, is if you're spending $100 this year, can you spend 97 next year? And they say, no, we can't do that. You would have to do it in your household if something happened that said you were going to lose 10% of your pay next year. You'd have to make do with that. But Washington doesn't have to because they can go to the taxpayer. In Medicare, they estimate that there is, what do we spend in Medicare? About $200 billion. And there's estimates that at least a third of that is waste, fraud, and abuse. Now, and that's because the government is so large that it can't oversee this. Less than 1 out of 1,000 bills presented to Medicare are actually looked at by a human eye and determined whether it's a good bill or not a good bill. And there's been times, in, you know, when you talk about waste, fraud, and abuse, a $35 bill at a hospital was paid. It was submitted as a $352,000 bill, and it was paid. Because it goes through the machine, they don't know what it is. So there is a lot of things in there. The worst thing the government does right now is it has no oversight or responsibility of how it spends the money. And what we're asking in our bills that we have presented to the president is we just want some accountability in how we're spending our money. We want some oversight. I'll give you a quick example. I was over to the University of Minnesota Crookston last week, and they have public-private partnerships between the university and some of their teachers and professors and researchers over there in groups like the wheat growers, the sugar beet growers, the corn growers. Now, the wheat growers, just for a quick instance, put up $50,000 last year to a researcher at the University of Minnesota Crookston and said, we want you to look into the wheat smut problem. There's a disease infecting some of the wheat, and we want to know how to get rid of it. They got the $50,000 grant. The year later, they had to come back with a report and outline to the wheat growers exactly how they had spent the money, what the research finding was, and give them a report on it. So they had to be accountable of how they spent the money. Washington, when we pass a bill, we spend the money and we don't ask anything. We don't know how it's spent. So I use AT&T as an example as well. AT&T at $17 billion just broke up into a subsidiary of 3 separate groups. Because at $17 billion, it said it could no longer efficiently service its customers the best way it could. So it decided to break into 3 groups so it could do a better job of providing a better service for less money. That's at $17 billion. Anybody here to believe that the government can run a $200 billion program and do it as efficiently as the private sector can, it can't be done. And that's where we need the oversight. We lose control of the dollars that we have. We are overtaxed in this country. I mean, we could provide the same level of services at a reduced rate of cost. We're not out there advocating of ending a lot of these programs or reducing the services that we give to the people who need help at certain times in their lives, to make sure we take care of our elderly, to make sure that the poor have adequate health care and shelter and clothing. But we can't continue to throw money at the problem without seeing how it's spent. And when the lady here mentioned, you know, about the waste, fraud, and abuse, every program is riddled with that. When we say we got a $5.5 trillion debt, you're right. If I'm not mistaken either, and I don't have the figures, but I think it's about $1 trillion that the federal employees, if you're a federal employee and you have the retirement fund, and there's $1 trillion that the government owes that fund, you've got paper, not dollars in that fund. For Social Security, by the year, I can't remember, it's within like 5 years, it'll be like $2.7 trillion in debt to the federal government. We look at the Highway Trust Fund is about $300 billion in debt to the federal government. That's why we can't release a lot of contracts for highways and bridges and infrastructure in this country, because the government has got it tied up in IOUs and they can't let it out so they can balance the budget, or it makes it look better on paper because we don't have the funds to do it. So yes, when you add all these up, there's estimates that we're anywhere between 8 and 11 trillion dollars in debt, not the 5.5. This is actual liabilities that the taxpayer is on the hook for. And this has got to be paid. And who do we owe this to? These dollars we owe to ourselves. We owe it to ourselves in Social Security, federal employee retirement trust funds, highway trust funds. They collect gas taxes on your money all the time. And they put it into the general fund, not fixing roads. Well, there's 162 trust funds in this country. 162 trust funds, and the government borrows from just about every one of them. And that's how it's been able to spend more money than it takes in.
Well, I just figure win or lose. Win or lose. At least I know I put my 2 cents in.
Voting is a way for me to express my opinion. It's the one time that they have to listen to me.
Feel real good when I vote. Gives me a chance to speak my piece.
I pull that lever and I think that's my vote, and nobody can change it.
On Election Day, vote for your candidate, vote for your country, but most of all, vote for yourself.
It's just one vote, but it's my vote.
Why would anybody give someone they don't know a gift? They do it because this gift saves lives, and the need for it is desperate. Please give blood. There's a life to be saved right now. Call the American Red Cross at 1-800-GIVE-LIFE.
Well, the opportunity to meet with Minnesotans at my tax freedom meetings was enjoyable and informative. And I hope our show this month helped you to understand the growing tax burden which continues to plague all Americans. Now, if you have questions or comments about taxes or any other issue, feel free to contact my office at the address or the telephone number that we'll be displaying on the screen. I'm Rod Grams. We'll see you next month.